Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Your microphones are all muted.
Hello.
What a group.
So colorful. Hi, everyone. So the top row of us are, 3 of us are here supporting Rob. My name is Melanie from the International Focusing Institute. We have Izzy, who's a volunteer and helping with some of the tech stuff. We have Rachel, who's going to help with some of the questions if Rob needs it.
Okay. Barry has his screen covered, or camera covered, which I do that too.
Sorry.
Okay. Well, shall we start?
Try to change it.
Okay.
Let's start. Is there anyone here brand new to Zoom? I have a little tutorial I could run through just on the chance that there's anybody brand new. Why don't I'll go ahead and do that. There we go. Well, so welcome to Exploring Gendlin's Philosophy with Rob Parker. This is the first of 4 sessions. So happy to have you here. My name is Melanie from the International Focusing Institute. We are an international cross-cultural organization dedicated to supporting individuals and groups worldwide who are teaching, practicing, and developing focusing and its underlying philosophy. So grateful to have Rob Parker volunteering to teach this course for the Institute. And we do expect a large group. So if there is anyone here brand new to Zoom, at the bottom of your screen, there's a main control panel that has your muting your microphone, stopping your video, and your participants tab and your chat. Those are the main ones you'll be wanting to pay attention to. If you have any audio issues, the little up arrow next to the unmute button is where you would want to check your connection. And if you'll tend to your own muting your microphone when you're not speaking, it will make for a better recording. We'd appreciate that. And you can stop and start your own video as you are comfortable. And if you find that you're having bandwidth issues on your end, that little up arrow to the right of stop video, you can check your settings, and you can also stop your video. That might improve your connection. For questions, the chat is open. You can either select everyone or just one person. We have labeled ourselves to make it a little easier for you. If you have any tech issues, you can write privately to Izzy or I or Rachel for any philosophy questions. She'll hold them for Rob. And of course, just sending them to everyone is fine too. And there's a few features at the bottom of your participants tab, such as raise hand when Rob pauses for questions, which I think he plans to do as needed throughout the presentation. And the little raise hand feature would be at the bottom generally of that screen. And then once I stop the screen share, in the upper right-hand corner of most screens, you can choose to view in speaker view, which would mean whoever's talking is the largest, and gallery view where everyone is the same size. And lastly, as you can see, this is being recorded, and everybody who registered will get a link to each class as soon as possible after it so that you can review. And if we do breakout sessions, those will not be part of the recording. So that's my spiel.
Okay. So I want to start by thanking Melanie and Rachel and Izzy for just being a wonderful support group and making all of this possible. And thank all of you for coming. I have some things to share that are very important to me, and I'm very glad that it's important to you also. And I want to also say at the beginning, uh, depending on how this works, in terms of questions and how fast we go, we might want to take a break about an hour into this and break into subgroups and chat with each other for maybe 5 minutes and put questions into the chat section. And or you can put questions into the chat section as we go. I think it's not practical to answer questions in midstream just because there's so much going on. But if we see questions in the chat section, then we can try to answer them on the fly, or maybe a 5-minute break and we can look at the questions and pick some to answer. So that will be how we do this. Does everybody understand? And if you understand, please raise your hand. And that will show us also that you know how to raise your hand. Raise your hand on your computer screen. In other words, the little blue hand raising thing. Yes, okay, great. Fantastic. Okay. I see a number of hands aren't raised though. If you don't know how to raise your hand, explore that a little bit while I'm talking, okay? And if you have a question, you can chat with either Melanie or Izzy, and they'll be able to help you back channel while we continue our discussion here. So today, I'm hoping to convince you that philosophy is not only important, it's essential for our survival. Then in the next 2 webinars, I want to talk about Gendlin's 2 most important books, Experiencing the Creation of Meaning and The Process Model. And of course, it'll be just kind of poking into them or talking about them because they're both worth years of study themselves. But we can at least get a sense of what they're about and how they're relevant to the larger problems that we're going to discuss today. Then in the final webinar, we'll discuss some scientific developments that support Gendlin's new way of thinking. But before we begin that, I'd like to talk to you about plumbing. Plumbing's interesting because our existence as societies and as individuals depends on plumbing. For example, think what would happen in Manhattan if there were no plumbing. That little piece of land couldn't support 8 million people if they had to draw their own water out of the East River and they had to dispose of their own sewage by throwing it out into the street. That it wouldn't be habitable. So it's important for our survival as a culture and as individuals, but it stays hidden behind walls and beneath floors, and most people don't understand plumbing. They just take it for granted until something breaks, and then we pay attention to it. Usually when something breaks, it's not a big deal. We can fix it ourselves or we can hire somebody to come in and look at it. But if something goes wrong on a large level, like imagine something goes wrong in the pipes beneath a large city, then it's more complicated. And one of the reasons that it's complicated is that there's the plumbing system that goes on in a large city like Manhattan or a European city, or you know, it's going to be an accumulation of pipes and fixes and repairs and workarounds over hundreds of years. So you're going to accumulate a very complex system, and it's going to be hard for anybody to understand it. Like, for example, there's stuff going on underground in Manhattan that nobody alive today knows about. There's tunnels that nobody knows where they go or where they are. And so it would be a big problem if you had to go into that. You have the thoughtless accumulation of small changes over many centuries. But normally we take it for granted, except when something breaks. And then when something breaks, we get foul water and bad smells seeping up through the floorboards. And then we start thinking about plumbing. Then we need an expert who can go in and understand this intricate complexity of accumulated workarounds and pipes, and also figure out a workable solution. So the reason I'm telling you this is because there's a British philosopher named Mary Midgley who has compared philosophy to plumbing. And she points out that philosophy is really a complex accumulation of ways of thinking, of metaphors or myths that we tell ourselves. And each of those has implications that aren't necessarily explored at the time. And as they build up, they kind of relate to each other and they form a very complex system of ways of understanding the world, which we mostly aren't aware of. We're just interested in getting through our day, and we take our usual conceptual system just for granted. And we don't look at what's behind it, what's going on inside it. Except when something breaks. And then we need somebody who can find a better way of thinking. And that's going to involve figuring out the mess that we got into already, which will involve going into a complex historical accumulation of earlier ways of thinking, which are inherent in what we're experiencing today. And then the philosopher's job at that point is going to be twofold. The philosopher is going to have to be able to understand this huge intricacy of the current way of thinking, and then also figure out a workable solution. And the workable solution will require somebody who has a poetic vision, like a large sense of what the big issues are and what we are concerned with, and also a very kind of nuts and bolts, lawyer-like mind that can go into very minute details to make sure that everything works together. So that's a beginning, a way of understanding what we're dealing with today. And I wonder how much sense did that make? Could you raise your hand if you followed me so far? Okay. Could you press no, like the red X, if you didn't understand, if that didn't make sense? Okay. And some people aren't voting, but it looks like this pretty much made sense. So then we can go into this further. I want to argue that things are going wrong today, that we have clear signs that our current plumbing is broken. And the signs are that we have problems that concern all of us in big ways. And these problems are difficult to think about. In other words, it's hard even to conceptualize the problem. And that's a sign that there's something wrong with our thinking, that we don't have concepts to be able to think about a problem clearly. So here are a couple of examples. Number one, we have an idea of a social contract that makes things work. So we have a government that came originally from, I guess, the American Revolution in this country. And we decided that we're not going to be ruled by kings, but we're going to make our own, we're going to put our own people in office. We're going to vote for people. And the people that, let me see here, okay. The people that we elect, then we agree to follow their rules or do what they say, unless we feel like they're not meeting their part of the contract, in which case we vote them out of office. So we have a contract. Um, we our relationships with each other are governed by contracts also. So we have this idea of a free society in which we're free from constraints except for constraints that we freely enter into, such as government, but also agreements to rent a building or a house from our landlord, and then also pay the landlord a certain amount of money. And so things like that. So corporations will hire people and pay us, and we'll do the work for them, and like that. So everybody understand what I'm talking about here? Could you raise your hands if you do? Okay. So we're all free. We can do whatever we want in a free society, and we have obligations that we agree to, and we don't have to be forced to do anything. And then we have, say, Mark Zuckerberg has the right to run Facebook however he wants. And so he can talk directly to a third of the population on Earth, and he can feed them fake news if he wants to. And somebody decides what hate speech is, but he's reluctant to do that. So there's hate speech happening on Facebook. And there's bad consequences for us, like our whole democracy is in trouble right now because of that. And yet he's a free person. He should be able to do whatever he wants. And yet he has tremendous power to influence most of the planet, a large number of people on the planet. And also he can actually damage our democracy. So we don't have a clear way of thinking about that. Is it okay for somebody to do that? And if it's not, why not? So does that make sense? Okay. Then another example. Corporations, governments, and billionaires can permanently destroy the environment. It's not like we're going to, have a big mess that can be cleaned up. It's like if the environment breaks down, it's going to be that way for maybe 100,000 years. And there'll be a lot of generations, if there are any generations of people, they'll be looking back wondering, what were we thinking about during this 50-year period when we made all this happen? And we had a chance to turn it around. So do we have any obligation to the planet, to other animals, to future generations? Or are we just independent people that we didn't sign any contract to take care of them, so we'll do what we want? Yeah? And again, I think the way the problem is formulated doesn't make sense, and we don't have a clear way of thinking about this. Another example, we believe in objectivity. And so, for example, we think the news should be objective. And yet, newspapers print things that don't seem to be objective, and we argue about what the truth is, and we don't have a clear way of deciding what's objective and what isn't. So Fox News can claim that and do claim that they're objective, and the rest of the world is not. And the other papers like the New York Times or the Washington Post claim that Fox News isn't objective, and there's no clear way of agreeing. And especially, like, you can argue about facts, and that's bad enough. But then you can also argue about perspectives and whose perspective is more important. So the idea of objective knowledge is something that's foundational for us, and yet it's not clear. So another problem where we don't have clear concepts. And I'll give you just a third one. The question of what are we as human beings? or as living things. So we could be, we thought of ourselves for many years as some, I don't know, incarnate parts of God, perhaps, or some vital spirit or something. But the model today is more like a machine. So the human body is a machine and the mind is like a computer. And I want to give you an example of how that sounds. Um, Here's an article which was printed in the Atlantic magazine just a couple of months ago. And the author is writing about the experience of being with somebody who's physically attractive and how that can be stressful to be with somebody who's really, really hot. And here's the description. Um, the problem starts with brain chemistry. When we see an attractive person, the left ventral tegmental area of the brain becomes active and will pump out dopamine. Dopamine is a stimulant to the brain, so some people might react with surprise or awkwardness. So, like all this time, all these years, I thought it was me that was attracted, but it's not. It's my uh, ventral tegmental area of my brain that's attracted to the other person. Who knew, right? Based on somebody's research, which used fMRI scans to observe the brain lighting up in response to stimuli, the left ventral tegmental area is responsible for pleasurable reactions to beauty. So it's not us at all, right? And just a little side issue here. They say that the brain lights up in response to stimuli, on these fMRI scans. How many people have heard that before? Yeah. Raise your hand on the screen, like I want to know if this is, okay, a lot of people have heard that. Okay. So look, I'm here to tell you that that's not true. The brain does not light up on those fMRI scans. What the fMRI scan is doing is measuring different areas of the brain and looking for how much activity is going on, usually blood flow or something. And it's making a probabilistic estimate. And for each pixel on the fMRI scan, you're getting a probability estimate that there's something going on there. And it's a statistical evaluation, and it's something like a bar graph. And the higher the bar goes, the closer you, the greater the certainty that there's something going on. That's indicated by a color change. And so that's what it means when the brain is lighting up. What's happening is that the computer's doing a statistical calculation and representing a number as a color on the screen. And so there's a kind of mythology that we're actually looking at the brain doing something. Actually, what we're doing is looking at a computer doing something. So let me finish this. Okay. So based on this research, the VTA, ventral tegmental area, is responsible for pleasurable reactions to beauty. The right VTA area provides dopamine that fuels romantic love. The left VTA appraises and appreciates what you see, but lighting up that part of the brain doesn't necessarily make you want to interact with the person. So that kind of language is pretty familiar, right? Like, how often do we hear that? Yeah. And let me give you another two people who are saying basically the same thing, but they're saying it more simply and directly. And let's going to start with Bertrand Russell, who says, man, his origin, his growths, his hopes and fears, his loves and his beliefs are but the accidental outcome of collocations of atoms. And Francis Crick, who gets a Nobel Prize several years ago for his work on the double helix, says you, in quotes, Your hopes and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. So how does that feel? Like, how many people feel like a vast collocation of atoms, or that your being is really just the activity of atoms and molecules, right? Uh, so the point I want to make here is that we know in some way that this isn't true, but there's also a deep, um, it's deep in our culture, deep in our system that we think that way. And um, and it has effects. Like one effect is that we see in movies and on TV, we see robots that are acting like people, right? How many people have seen that? Um, and and audiences buy that. You know, if they didn't, they wouldn't go to the movies. But it has other effects too. For example, there's the people who are deeply religious are are very disturbed by this. It feels to them like liberal society is undermining religious and cultural values. They would call it a liberal scientistic society. And that's not entirely wrong, right? There's truth in that. Also, there's a loss of meaning, a loss of sense of meaning, that that life isn't meaningful if we're just robots and molecules that are interacting with each other for reasons of chemistry. That's not a meaningful existence. Uh, and so our scientific worldview implicitly denies meaning. Can you see that? Like, raise your hand if you do. Yeah. Okay. Raise your hand if you don't agree. Okay. Um, so I think this is a big deal. This affects us in a lot of ways. One sign is an increasing number of deaths of despair, where people are killing themselves either outright or by drug abuse or something like that. So there's actually now a category that sociologists use. They call it deaths of despair. Uh, and we also have just generally a breakdown of social cohesion, meaning shared values. Our sense of what values should be is not clear anymore. And people are sort of breaking up and going in different directions. And one example of that is in the US, we have the American dream, which is sort of the one thing that we would all hold together, that holds us together, that we would all share. Back in the early 1800s, de Tocqueville came to the US, this French aristocrat, and he was writing about what it was like in this new country. And he said everybody was sort of beaming with excitement that we were doing this incredible experiment of self-government. And it gave apparently meaning to everyone. And de Tocqueville remarked on that. But today, what's the American dream? The American dream is you make enough money to buy a house, right? And you make more money than your parents did, right? What kind of meaning is that? So I want to argue here that we're looking at a breakdown of meaning in our society, and it comes from that our concepts aren't working. And so we want now to, actually we can't do it, but other philosophers have dug up the streets uh, underneath our society and gone down and looked at the plumbing under there and described what has led to this. So I want to start off talking about that this really has a history. And we can start the history back in the medieval world, where, let me do my screen share here. There we go. So in the medieval world, you had uh, a reality, a world that was made of 5 elements: earth, air, fire, water, and ether. And you had everything made out of that. And you had you had earth at the center, uh, fire and ether were at the top. The ether was what the heavenly bodies were made out of. And you had a whole system of, of things that were related to each other. It was like an organic whole. So the earth at the bottom, at the center, was intrinsically related to heaven above and everything in between. It related to their understanding of physics, how the world worked down here, and also how come the planets and the stars go in circular motions. And it related to social organizations. So you had like God at the top, and then maybe the Pope and the kings, and all the way down to the the middle class, and then the lowest uh, peasants, and uh, and you had and then going down to animals, different levels of animals, down to bugs and stuff. So they had everything organized and according to this system. Also medicine, you had the 4 humors that corresponded to the elements, and religion, of course. So when you look at the medieval world, you weren't looking at objects located in space. You were looking at everything organically related to everything else. And this began to change when Copernicus suggested that maybe the Earth goes around the sun. And to us, we could say it's revolutionary, but it's just changing the paths of 2 objects in space. Either the sun moves or the Earth moves. But it wasn't that for the medieval people. It was that the whole world came unglued. The sun was part of the ethereal outer area, and the Earth was, by its nature, it was it was stable. It was the bottom of everything. It was the place of corruption and change, uh, and Copernicus changed that. So we went through a way of as the medieval world fell apart. We came to gradually develop a replacement, a new way of thinking. And so I want to show you that. And what we're going to do is see how we got to where we are as part of a process of then going back and fixing it. So let me see here. There we go. Okay, can everybody see that? Okay. So let's see, it's not perfect for me though. Okay, so we have, when Copernicus has the Earth going around the sun, that's the beginning of something. It means that the world, the universe is made of separate things that are all basically matter. And they're not qualitatively different depending on where they are, and they don't relate to each other in any particular way, except by external forces. And So a beginning of looking at that with people like Kepler and Galileo was studying how objects move in space. And so a simple model of that could be like a cannon, where a cannonball goes out of the muzzle of the cannon, and then you're interested in where the cannonball lands. So you study how the angle of the barrel of the cannon relates to the angle of the ball that's going out of the cannon, and then you can study this abstractly, like mathematically. You can make a vertical y-axis and a horizontal x-axis, and then you can have the path of the cannonball indicated by the arrow V. And then if you plot that out, you get this neat figure, which is called a parabola. And so what are you doing? You're taking let's go back. You're taking a complex situation where there's somebody shooting a cannon at somebody else, and there are many things to be interested in. What's the cannon made out of? What's the cannonball made out of? Who are the people that are doing this? Why are they doing it to somebody else? How does the other person, the receiver of the cannonball, how do they feel about it? And so there's a lot there to worry about. But what the early people were doing, Kepler, Galileo, was stripping all of that out and just looking at the path of the cannonball and looking at it as a mathematical abstraction. It's a geometric figure that we call a parabola. And so all of the human meaning goes, and we have instead a mathematical model of what's happening. And it turns out that this parabola is part of a mathematical geometric system. So if you take a cone and you pass, I don't know if you can see my arrow moving. Can you see that? I'm moving my cursor over this. Does that show up?
I can't see it.
You can't see it? Okay. But you see a cone, right? And then you see the purple area, which is like a plane going through the cone, and that makes a parabola. So who knew that the path that a cannonball makes through space corresponds to the shape of a plane going through a cone? And that kind of thinking led to all kinds of interesting developments, which have led to us being able to talk to each other on Zoom over wide distances. And so the parabola appears in many places now. Parabola is a very powerful concept.
Rob, we're still seeing the medieval castle. Are we on the right picture?
Oh, okay. You're on the wrong picture, which means I'm not on the right picture. Oh, it's paused my screen sharing. That's not very nice. Okay. So you're still looking at the cannon, right?
Yes.
Okay. So let's see. You've got the cannon now, right?
Correct.
Okay. Now, okay, does that change?
Yes.
Okay. So there's the people measuring the angle of the cannonball. And there's the graph. Can you see that?
Yes, and we can see your cursor now too. If you
Oh,
want
good.
to
Okay.
demonstrate with
Okay.
it.
Wow. Okay. And then you can see the parabola that's made by the path of the cannon, of the cannonball. And you can see the x and the y-axis here. You could just map that out onto space. So we've got the x-axis here, and the x-axis is horizontal and the y-axis is vertical. And so there's the path of our cannonball. And then we can see it, the shape of the the plane, when it goes through a cone, that makes a parabola. And so what I'm trying to say is that this mathematical analysis is actually pretty interesting. Like, why would a cone know about the path of cannonballs? And then we can go and look at applications of it. For example, you see a roller coaster now, right?
That's right.
And arches and a suspension bridge. So you can do a lot with this mathematics. And one of the really interesting things you can do is you can plot orbits around the Earth, because the orbits that satellites like the Moon or the International Space Station make, they make parabolas, or actually ellipses, which it's you tilt the plane through the cone so that it makes a closed figure instead of an open figure, and you get orbits of planets. And then you can do things like you can send a spacecraft to Mars. So you can do very interesting things with this stuff. Let me stop the screen share now. And from that, we develop a new way of thinking over time. New way of thinking is based on seeing things in space. It's based on perception. And we model our science on an observer who sees things out there in space just as they are, seeing them objectively. And what we see out there is made of parts that don't change. We have it like a cannonball that's traveling through space. And where things do change, we explain the change as being made of a rearrangement of smaller parts. So if our car gets into a fender bender, that would be a rearrangement of parts. If you take salt and pour it into water so it dissolves, the sodium and the chlorine atoms separate and dissolve into the water, so it's a rearrangement of parts. And I don't know, when you build a laptop computer that can operate Zoom, that's an arrangement of parts. And the arrangement is done by external forces that change the location of particles, atoms, or something in space. And so that turns out to be a very powerful way of thinking. Part of it is to take, when you have something complex, you break it down into simpler parts. And you break it down into parts that don't change, at least in our model. And the fact that we're dealing with parts that don't change makes the whole thing very suitable for mathematical analysis, because numbers are fixed units that don't change. And so we have a system that's done us pretty well over the years. And I want to check again now, how much sense is this making? Okay, could maybe raise your hands and just tell me with a hand up if it's making good sense, or hand down if it's not making sense. Okay. And on my screen, I'm just getting the first few people raising their hands and nobody else is. Is anybody else? Melanie or Izzy, are you seeing that?
Yes, not everyone is raising their hand.
Oh, okay. Okay.
We can do that little poll anytime you want to.
Okay, but I think just yes or no is good enough for right now. And we'll take some time at the end to answer questions that are posted on the discussion section. Okay, so this is what Gendlin calls the unit model. It's based on fixed units that are just what they are. And in other words, there's nothing to be understood about them except what we know about them. A cannonball's a cannonball, an atom's an atom. A lepton is a lepton. It is just what it is. And we understand change as the change of their motion in space. But this way of thinking has a couple of implications. And this is where our philosopher Plummer gets involved. If we have an observer that's looking at the world and describing it just as it is, the observer isn't part of that picture. The observer can't be made of unchanging parts that change location in space. The observer is creatively understanding something. They don't say it that way, but the observer is out of the picture. And so then the observer is subjective, not quite real. And also values and meaning and ethics are subjective and not quite real. They're not part of that picture of fixed things that are determinate and are just what they are. So that's one problem. Another problem is, how do we know what the units are? If our observer is going to recognize, say, a cannonball, then there must be a correspondence between something in us and something out there in the world. And so that might mean that we have maybe templates in our heads that correspond to something out there. Or it might mean that we're living in a matrix-like simulation, you know, the movie Matrix, where maybe it's everything is being faked and like the input is being pumped into us somehow. And so it leads to questions like, how do we know that the color that we see as red is the same color that somebody else sees as red? Has anybody heard that question before? Yeah. And you see it's a correspondence between what's out there and what's in here. Something has to be duplicated and it could be faked. And so that leads to questions about how do we know what the truth is? So we have a lot of issues here. Another result of this is that well, values and morality aren't objective. So what are they then? Are they just made up fictions? We don't have a good way of thinking about that. Whose values have precedence? For example, are we all just equal and we do whatever we want, limited by the contractual arrangements that we've made, and really there are no values beyond the contracts? And then why have contracts? And who says that life is better than death? So a lot of questions from just not having a basis for, not being able to be clear about this observer who's looking at the world from outside. Another result is that time is linear. And so you remember the picture of the graph. I can try to bring it back, but I don't want to take the time right now. But remember that chart with the parabola? And so the line is actually moving in time. So the bottom axis, the x-axis, is time. And it makes it easy to think of time as if it were a line. And so we look forward into the future, we look backward into the past, and we're right now at this point in time, as if we're a point on a line. And who knew that that kind of thinking could come from studying the motion of objects in space? And And another thing is a little more difficult, but also really important, that we see things just as they are, and the things out there are just what they are. What we're really doing is defining things in terms of our own concepts and purposes. The only thing that is really just what it is something that's made by us for a purpose, right? Like a tree is continuously growing and changing, and the tree has some kind of internal um, organizing of itself, and is something different than just a thing. Something that we make, like a laptop computer, is just what it is, and its definition is what we've made it to be. So the only thing that can really be just what it is what's made by us, for us. And what do we end up doing? We end up interpreting the world that way. So we look at our environment and we think of it as it's just what it is. And what it is the use that it has for us. So we can look at a forest in terms of the amount of lumber we can get out of it. And we look at our environment today in terms of, and as some people do, most of us don't have the power to do this, but some people are able to look at the environment today and gauge how much money they can make from continuing the way we are before the environment becomes unlivable. And so I want to suggest that this way of thinking, what Gendlin calls the unit model, has been very useful. And we wouldn't want to be without it. In fact, we don't have a choice. We couldn't live without it at this point. It's one of the great achievements of humankind, but it's reaching the edge of its usefulness and it's becoming destructive. And so we've got plumbing breaking deep under the ground. And we have serious problems in the world. These are problems that could wipe us out. And so philosophy becomes of vital importance to us and to the world. So again, show of hands, and maybe we could take a poll at this time. Maybe tell us on a scale of 1 to 5 how much sense this makes. And while we're setting up the poll, okay. Everybody can see that now, right?
Yes, people are responding.
Okay.
And we're getting lots of 4s and 5s.
Okay, good. Okay. Okay, so that's about right. I think 4 is, well, 4 is obviously the dominant one, and that's how I feel about it too. I don't fully understand this myself. This is big. This stuff is big, but I think we can see this is really important that we look at this. And so this is the world that Gene comes into when he starts his new philosophy. But he doesn't come into it just out of nowhere. Back in the mid-1800s, you had people like Dostoevsky who were already seeing big trouble here. And in fact, more than that, there's a lot of people, maybe if we have time, we can go back over it. But from the time that the unit model started developing, back in the time of Kepler and Galileo, even back with Copernicus, there were people that were very disturbed by it. But let me read you something. Okay, this is John Donne writing in about 1611. So this is Copernicus dies in 1543. So almost 100 years after Copernicus, um, he says, and new philosophy calls all in doubt. The element of fire is quite put out. The element of fire being a spiritual thing, like the sun, and you know the rising up towards God. That element is quite put out. The
Hi,
earth is
I'm in that document.
the earth is lost, and the earth and no man's wit can well direct him where to look for it. So when the sun is lost and the earth is lost, they don't mean objects in space. They mean that organic medieval world that uh, that was being broken up by Copernicus and then by the experiments of Galileo and others. Uh, so the sun, as they knew it, being a spiritual uh, part of the organized universe, and the earth, meaning the dense, inert thing that was at the center of things. Those were taken away when we started looking at them just as neutral objects in space. So the sun is lost in the earth, and no man's wit can well direct him where to look for it. And freely men confess that this world's spent, it's over, when in the planets and in the firmament they seek so many new worlds, and then see that this world is crumbled out again to atoms, meaning like dust and bones. 'Tis all in pieces, all coherence gone, all just supply and all relation. So relationships are breaking apart. Prince, subject, father, son are things forgot, for every man alone thinks he hath got to be unique, and that then can be none of that kind of which he is but he. So I'm going to be myself, and I don't care about being a prince or a subject or a father or a son. All of those meanings break down with the medieval world breaking down, and I'm just going to be myself. And so the world falls apart. Um, yeah. So there's a history here, um, and so it leads to people being uncomfortable with the loss of the old spiritual coherent world, and um, sort of bemoaning the this new world, which is dry bones and just abstract meanings. And then we get as far as 1865, we start having something turning around, like people starting to think about this in a more critical way. And so we have a mathematics student who is finishing his PhD dissertation, and he has a problem developing a mathematical model of time, and he needs that for his dissertation to finish. And so he asks for time to work out a new way of mathematically modeling what time is. And he thinks it'll take a few months. It turns out it takes him the rest of his life. The man who did that was Henri Bergson, who wrote a very articulate critique of the unit model, uh, and developed some very useful ideas about it. And then after Bergson, more people, Wittgenstein, Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, and many others. And it's this world that Gendlin comes into. And so that's where we're going to start next week, looking at how Jean has addressed these issues and what it would mean for us if we take in a new way of thinking. So then maybe this is a place to stop and break for 5 minutes. And we can look over questions. And I think we can put people in pairs. Is that right? Melanie or Izzy?
Yes, we can put them in pairs.
Okay. So let's try that. And then when you're, we'll just put you with a partner and talk about what you've heard so far and discuss if you have any questions. And if you have any questions, you can put it in the Zoom group chat. And then we can look at it and then we can have a Q&A afterwards. Okay. Someone comments about why do we need to spend so much time on this? I think the reason to spend time on this is that most people don't seem aware of this. We're living in a society that seems to me like we're dream walking and sleepwalking, and that we take for granted the world as we experience it today. And we don't realize that this has a history and that there's a complex web of assumptions that underlie the problems that we're facing today. As we have a smaller group right now, does anybody want to ask a question?
So hello, I put the question about Kuhn and I'll wait for your answer.
Oh, yeah.
My other comment was, so you mentioned a lot of people, thinkers like Wittgenstein and Heidegger, and you didn't mention, at least I didn't hear, Dilthey.
Yeah.
Can you also include him?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Gene Wood. Yeah.
I know.
I didn't want to, I didn't want to give a whole list of names. I picked the highlights for me. And in the part of the thread for me is the directly confronting a paradigm or a model, and I guess trying to build a new metaphysics. So, but it's just very, very rough. I just pulled out a few names.
Fair
Does
enough.
that make sense?
Yeah, fair enough. I guess I'm particularly interested in German thinkers' influence.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
Heidegger, Husserl, Wittgenstein, Austrian, Anglo-Austrian.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm really interested in what you have to say about Kuhn, because it seems to me, I think I read somewhere Gendlin talking about thinking freshly, and what Kuhn discusses are converge. I'm not saying that very well.
Well, let me try to just talk about Gendlin and Kuhn.
Okay.
Because I think that'll answer your question. Gendlin is very compatible with Kuhn. Kuhn's notion of normal science, that would be the like the logical development of an expansion of an established paradigm, and then it runs aground and needs to be needs a new paradigm, and so we get a scientific revolution. The scientific revolution part is not well understood in unit model terms. And Kuhn came in for a lot of criticism from people who couldn't have a world where things aren't just what they are. You know what I'm talking about, right? Yeah. I can't hear you though.
Yes, I do know what you mean. Sorry, my mic was off. It just seemed to me when you talked about philosophy like plumbing as an accumulation, a historical accumulation, that that just seemed like it was saying something un-Kuhnian.
I see what you mean. Well, this is Mary Midgley, so I'll blame it on her, but I'll also say that really every time we run into a paradigm clash, we do a workaround and we develop some new ideas that we paste onto or we combine with the old ideas.
Yes.
And so it really does work with the plumbing metaphor in that way.
Yes, yes, I see what you're saying. It's like the theta.
Yeah, yeah, that's an interesting question. It's really, I think what has been called the Whig view of history, which Kuhn criticized, is sort of intuitively accepted by most people. You know, that we have a natural progress of science. We have a continuous line from ancient people discovering more and more truth, accumulating facts, and ending up where we are right now on October 31st, 2019. And imagine if the linear progress was going to be, you know, end up where we're going to be in October 31st, 2025. For us, then the line would be off, right? It would be missing us, and we'd say that that it was wrong in some way. Linear progress doesn't work.
I think you make a very cogent case for why new thinking is needed at this historical moment.
Yeah, yeah, new concepts. Yeah. Okay, so everybody's back now, right? Raise your hand if you're not back. And let's see if we have any questions. So part of scientific parts style of perception, would you say? I can't understand the question, but it looks interesting. Could Melanie or is he unmute?
I can unmute.
Frank O'Neill?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay, yes. Can you ask your question?
Yes. It sounds like you were implying, but maybe didn't say, that this kind of more and more separate way of looking at things and with models of parts that are lifeless, that part of that transition to this kind of unit model perception, would you say has drawn us more and more into conceptualizing everything that we see instead of
Yes.
feeling into it?
That's right. So the unit model, having everything be just what it is, eliminates what Gendlin would call the implicit. And it puts our concepts at the top. When we describe why something happens, we describe our concept of what something is and how it interacted with our concept of what something else is. And so we have laws of physics, laws of nature, and we have a kind of a top-down system. And so that's kind of turns things around. One of the things Gendlin is going to want to say is that the order that we find comes from our interaction with the world, and it's a bottom-up process. It's an emergent process. And so we're going to say more about that. But that's interesting.
Great, thanks.
Okay. I don't see very many questions here, and maybe it's just my screen. Maybe we could just ask people to raise their hands if they want to ask a question. And maybe one of our technical people could look at the hands raised and call on people, because it's I have just a little tiny space where I can see hands.
Sure. There was also Claire had a question. Okay. Do you want to unmute yourself, Claire, who's asking? Or no, sorry, Catherine. Kathleen, does Gendlin suggest we go back to the medieval worldview? Kathleen is asking.
That's a nice question. No, we can't, right? It would be like we can't throw out the unit model. That are we're always carrying forward with what we already have and then going further. We couldn't go backwards. An example would be if you didn't like something, would you be able to forget it? And we can't. We can't undo experiences. We go forward. Yeah. Does that address your question? Okay.
Kathleen says yes.
Oh, good. Okay. Somebody else.
I had a question. While talking with Dennis in the breakout rooms,
Mm-hmm.
I surprised myself to say something, and I wanted to run it by you. It appeared to me that in relieving ourselves of only working within the chain or like the unit, the single unit kind of way of looking at things, that we might be able to flow with objects or places or people or ideas. And by that, what I mean is kind of working in interaction with that idea or that thing or that place, and working, assuming that they have their own implicit way of being or corresponding with the world.
But you can't have implicit with units. Units are just what they are. So, for example, take like a watch. Yeah, it is just what it is. But in order to know what a watch is, you have to understand time and how we use time in this society. And don't you also have to understand basically that a watch would be manufactured someplace and that it's made out of intricate stuff inside. And then that the like the it's mind, the material from it is mind and put together, and so you have to understand how a society could do that, and you'd have to understand how a society thinks about time and what time means for us. Otherwise, you wouldn't know what a watch is. So it isn't just what it is. Does that make sense? Okay. Anybody want to argue with that? Okay. So what I'm saying here is that nothing is just what it is, and that there's a fundamental wrongness about the unit model. Unit model is a good approximation, and it's been very, very useful, and it's not to put it down, but that it's wrong in this respect, that there's really nothing that is just what it is. Yeah. So what else? Did I answer your question, Claire?
No, I don't know. I don't know
You don't
anymore.
think so? Yeah, okay. If you think about it, modeling whatever you're thinking about, like try modeling that mathematically, where you have units like numbers that represent what you're talking about, or some geometric figure or something that represents what you're talking about. And it's not allowed to change. It has to stay the same. And then imagine just rearranging those unit parts and trying to do something with that. And you'll find that probably it's going to be pretty hard. Okay, somebody else?
Rob, I sent you one in chat. Richard Crease.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So, so he asks, what about Bergson, Heidegger, and Husserl? How did they prepare the way for Gendlin? So that's a big discussion. We don't even have enough time to really go into Gendlin very far. But I think what they've done, and there's a whole history of philosophy here, not just them, but they've done some really important things. I'm not sure, do you want me to try to answer the question, what I think they've done? Maybe you could go off mute.
I was asking you just to be very brief, and,
Okay.
and yeah.
Yeah. I think like Bergson's introduction to metaphysics outlines the problem pretty well. And I find that impressive. And then others after him, Heidegger and Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, of course, you know what they've done. Uh, they've gone deeply into this, but it hasn't come together in a coherent way. I think in a big enough way that we can hold. What am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that I think Gendlin carries forward this discussion uh, in a useful and original way. I think I'll just say that.
Thanks. That's helpful. I gotta start.
Okay. Okay. Anyone else? This actually, I think this works better. Do you guys agree? Yeah, I like much better talking to real people. And if we open the, if I can talk a little bit and then pause and we can have a discussion. So I think this is a good way to use Zoom. Okay, but I need another question and I can't really read the screen very well.
We have another question.
Oh, good.
Is this from Milagros? Can you speak more about the ways in which the unit model limits our day-to-day living and understanding? And let me just give you this one also. Would you recommend that we read some of those earlier philosophers? So maybe just some recommended reading before we end.
I think the question of reading is difficult because there's so much, and also some of the reading is difficult, and so I think a way to begin. Let me see. I think that actually Mary Midgley has a paper which is called Philosophy and Plumbing. And that's where I took my introduction from. And I think that she doesn't do anything that Gene is doing particularly, but she lays the thing out. She lays the problems out, I think, in a nice way. And plus it's readable. You don't have to struggle with it. So I would recommend that. And you can find it easily on the internet.
Rob, would you just give the spelling of Mary's last name, or could somebody put it in? Could you put it in chat, Melanie or me?
Midgley, I believe.
Okay, and just back to the other question, can you speak more about the ways in which the unit model limits our day-to-day living and understanding?
Okay, then it's a question of just how to begin. I don't know. Well, okay, so you get up in the morning, you wake up because your alarm clock went off, and your alarm clock didn't go off because you were at a point in your sleep cycle where it was good to wake up. It went off because we have time measured out in units, and you're supposed to be at work at a certain time. And so you get up and you go through a routine and you show up at work, and then at work, what are you? You're a resource, the way I described, like you're a unit, part of an organization chart, and you're replaceable with other equivalent units that they could hire. And you're there to be exploited for the value that you can give to the company. And if there are problems, they have a Department of Human Resources to deal with you. And then we, I don't know, we go to a party and we look at who we're with, and maybe we evaluate people according to identities like race or color or social class units. And I don't know, it seems like it's everywhere. It's like asking a fish to point to where the water is. But does that give at least a beginning? Who asked the question? Okay, I see a thumbs up. Would anybody else want to add to that? About Frank?
Yeah, I think the unit model, to the extent we live by that, just takes us into our heads. So we're just conceptualizing everything
That's
we
right.
experience,
That's
which
right.
means then we start to not pay attention to or trust our felt knowingness about things, our relationship to things in this kind of emergent not knowing mode where at first we just feel something and then we don't ever investigate it because we're busy constructing who we are and what the world is.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Actually, I was trained as a psychologist, and the unit model has just left a big footprint right in the middle of that field. We want to know what's wrong with somebody. If somebody comes in with a problem, first of all, what's wrong? That means you're a machine that's not working properly, and how do we fix you? Another question could be, what's keeping you from growing further growth, or how are the problems that you're experiencing, how are those part of the meaningful life that you're living? Those questions aren't usually asked. It's mostly what's wrong and how do we fix it? And then what's wrong gets identified as you've got an anger problem or you're depressed. And then what does that mean? Well, that's a unit, and you can look up the meanings of those things in dictionaries. You don't have to, you know. And so, like, just for example, I've spent about mostly working with trauma, and I began working with also the sources of trauma, sort of going upstream to find out where the trauma comes from. So I worked with batterers for about 5 years. And I also worked with adolescent sex offenders for about 5 years. So I'm working with people who are generating trauma. And so we had anger groups for the men, and for the kids, a lot of them were angry teenagers, and they identified themselves as angry. And so I can tell you, in 10 years, I never met an angry person. You know, everything that had been identified as anger turned out to be something else. And so there's the unit model. And I think it doesn't do any good to, I don't know, to train somebody to identify their anger and then distract themselves from it by counting to 10 or something like that. Much better to go into what's the anger mean? And it turns out that it's not a unit. It turns out to be an intricacy. And simply exploring that intricacy turns out to be helpful. So there's another place where the unit model happens. And the way names and assumptions get thrown around in politics today is another example. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is here, don't get me started. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, I think you've done this in the past. Might you be offering an online course on reading a process model?
Yes, we're going to be starting an online course in after this is over, like in a few weeks. And also there are other groups reading Experiencing the Creation of Meaning. I think there are some philosophers in the room, and so I'm not a philosopher, so I'm hesitant to say much about it. But in my experience, I think philosophy is incredibly interesting and really important, but not for everybody. And many people have, for example, many people have failed to read Experiencing the Creation of Meaning or the process model and gone on to lead healthy, useful, productive lives. We all have our own paths. And so philosophy can be a path. If it turns out to be a path that you like, it's incredibly rich and rewarding. But it really, really helps to have somebody who knows the path already take you through it the first time or so. It'd save a lot of trouble. So we read the books together, and it's very helpful. Okay. So my sense is that this arrangement here works pretty well when we're just talking. There aren't that many comments, and so we can handle them. And that me just talking to you without Q&A breaks is not as good as what we're doing now. How many people agree with that? Okay. And so let us pause here, and we'll pick it up next week. And next week we will, we're going to look at experiencing the creation of meaning. And this is you could say it's a lifelong project, but we'll, in an hour and a half, we'll look a little bit at what he's trying to address there. And we'll discover some interesting things in the process. Okay, everybody?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks, everybody. See you next week.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks all.